Hi, everybody. Welcome to Be Like Christ. Welcome to our daily 5-minute Bible study. We are in Job chapter 33 today. As you may remember from yesterday, chapter 32, we just were introduced to a new individual, Elihu. And so chapter 33 is really where he begins speaking and laying out this wisdom, in quotes maybe, that he claims to have over and above Job and the other three friends that have been speaking for the majority of this book. If you would like our PDF, you can download it at tobelikechrist.com, and there's a link down in the description to the website. I suppose in our section breakdown, I could have added another section just right here for Elihu, but we didn't, and so we're still in the second section here, chapters 3 through 37. Job and his friends are discussing the reason for his suffering, and now Elihu is included in this group. Elihu, let's reintroduce him as the main speaker of this chapter. He had been listening to the conversation between Job and his three friends for a good period of time, and he speaks and he shares his opinions for the first time in chapter 32. That's kind of the preface to what he's going to say, and now he's going to really get into it here in chapter 33. He is the youngest of the group, which is why he spoke last, because he wanted his elders to speak first. We have a total of 33 verses today, chapter 33 verses. Our first section today is going to be verses 1 through 7, which is going to be kind of a continued introduction to what Elihu's going to say. So Elihu addresses Job first before his friends, and he reassured him that he wanted to be fair with his words. He didn't want to take sides. He wanted to speak with sincerity and righteousness. He positioned himself as Job's equal and as being unbiased to the situation. Maybe Job's friends had more stake in the relationship or something like that. So he kind of presents himself as, I'm coming at this in an unbiased way. I don't have any vested interest one way or another. So now in our second section, verses 8 through 33, we're finally going to get to see what Elihu thinks and figure out if he really has all these insights that the other ones have missed. This second section is entitled Elihu's Rebuke. Elihu, like Job's three other friends, was very quick to begin accusing Job. So he said, Job, I'm going to be unbiased, but then he kind of launches into a similar attack to what we've seen in the last three friends in the speeches that they've given. He took issue with Job's claim that he was a righteous man, and he also took issue with the claim that God had become Job's enemy. Elihu was partially right, and he was partially wrong. He was wrong to assume that Job was guilty of hidden sin. He takes that assumption and wholeheartedly believes it, just like Job's three friends. You're being punished, Job, because you've done something wrong. So that tells you a little bit about whether Elihu really has a lot of wisdom here, or what we're going to see from him in the next couple chapters. So he takes that wrong assumption, and he's wrong about that. Job hadn't done anything wrong. But he was correct that Job shouldn't have counted God as his enemy or as his adversary, because we know from chapters 1 and 2 that it was really Satan who was Job's adversary. He also didn't like the fact that Job kept claiming that God wouldn't answer his prayers or his complaints or his pleas for help. He told Job that God speaks in a lot of different ways, not just through words. Sometimes he speaks through dreams, or sometimes he speaks through discipline. And towards the end of the chapter, Elihu is going to take a similar stance to Job's friends. Essentially, he's going to tell Job that God is speaking to him, that God is answering him. He's answering him through disciplining him. That's how God has chosen to speak in this particular moment. That Job's suffering was God trying to get Job to repent of whatever secret sin he was hiding. So Elihu said, Job, God is answering you, but you are too stubborn to listen. You're too stubborn to take a moment and think about what God is actually trying to say to you and trying to get you to do. Elihu also suggested that God can speak through messengers, someone who comes to correct Job and restore him. And it seems like Elihu may have believed that he was such a messenger coming with God's message to fix Job. Elihu describes this hypothetical future Job, this repentant Job, who has put his sins behind him and is now basking in the joy and the mercy of God. And he says, Job, this is what your life could be like, but you're too stubborn to listen to God's discipline. Elihu, after saying these things, and of course he has more things to say, he feels like he has really enlightened Job, and he challenges Job to respond, saying this, quote, If you have any words, answer me, speak, for I desire to justify you. If not, listen to me, be silent, and I will teach you wisdom. So, while Elihu's explanation of Job's suffering was maybe a little bit more developed than Job's friends, with this idea of teaching through discipline and God speaking through discipline, it ultimately came back to the same erroneous point, and it was built on the same erroneous foundation that Job was being punished because he refused to repent of some sin in his life. So, while Elihu, yes, he has some wisdom and makes some good points, there's still that really wrong underlying assumption. Job's friends just think that God works in these absolutes. Like, Job, if you're being punished, it's because you've done something wrong, and they think that he cannot argue with this. The reality is they're the ones who are wrong about it. Let's go ahead and talk about our application now. We know from Job 1 and 2 that Job is not being disciplined because of some unrepentant sin in his life, but that brings up a good question. Would God ever discipline somebody that he loves for the purpose of course correcting them when they wander off the path of godliness, holiness, righteousness? And the answer to that is yes, and we get this answer from the other books of the Bible. There are several passages and examples in the Old Testament and in the New Testament that teach us that God does use discipline kind of in a similar way to a parent, to guide, to correct bad behavior, and to train his children. Especially in books like Judges, if you remember that study, which feels like it was a really long time ago, we read about God allowing foreign nations to come in and discipline his people, to oppress his people, the Israelites, to teach them the consequences of not following his instructions and his law. There's a really clear, probably the clearest passage on this is in the book of Hebrews, Hebrews chapter 12. There's a great passage that teaches us that God disciplines people that he loves, not just people that he's mad at. Hebrews 12, 5 and 6. And have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and chastises every son whom he receives. You sometimes hear people say, well, a parent that doesn't discipline their child doesn't love them because they don't really care what they end up becoming or growing into or how unruly or rebellious they are. A parent that loves disciplines. And so we see that with God. He's trying to shape us and form us. Sometimes he uses discipline to do that. So in this, Elihu was technically right. He was just wrong in applying it to Job's specific situation. And once again, we see that Job's friends and Elihu, they want to talk about God with these absolute rules, and the reality is God is much more complicated. And so for us today, when we do experience some kind of struggle, some kind of discipline, we can say, perhaps this is the discipline of God correcting me, correcting something in my life. It's not an absolute. We can't say that about every bad thing that happens to every person every time, but it is one way that God works in his very complex nature. That's our study in Job chapter 33. Sometimes I finish these videos and I just realize, I don't think I did that in 5 minutes. But if you play me on 1.5 speed on YouTube, it'll still be 5 minutes. Does that count? It should. I'll see you tomorrow.